establish the credentials of Jesus, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, why does all of that matter anyway? Why does genealogy matter? Why is genealogy important? It tells you something about where you have come from. And when some of those things are missing, you want to know what they are, don't you? The genealogy is important because it grounds a person in historical circumstances, in a particular place and time. And that's what happens here. Matthew sets out to establish the credentials of Jesus because he is the son of David, the son of Abraham, and you will notice, of course, that he is called Jesus Christ, which means Jesus the Messiah. And so what he wants to tell us right from the very first verse is that Jesus Christ, this Jesus Christ, is a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. That is Matthew's intention through this gospel, to show that Jesus is the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament. And so what he writes is grounded in an understanding of the Old Testament. You know, sometimes I've heard some people say, well, we Christians only need the New Testament. Well, if you've only got the New Testament, I'm afraid you're missing an awful lot. We need the whole of the canon of Scripture, the Old Testament and the New Testament, because to make sense of it, we need the Old Testament. Otherwise, why does Matthew say time and again, this happened to fulfill what the prophet wrote? Now, the Gospel of Matthew, here's an outline. The Gospel of Matthew is divided into 5 sections or books. And the fact that it's divided into 5 sections should tell you something straight away if you're familiar with the Old Testament. Let's see if you can work it out, huh? Jesus is that prophet like Moses. Why 5 sections? Exactly. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. So that is telling us something about this Jesus, because he is the new Moses and he is proclaiming the law. That's what happens here. So in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is Moses giving the law. That's what's happening there. And of course the 5 books are like the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And what Jesus does in those books is he shows how to live. That's what he does. Each section ends with a formula. And that formula is, when Jesus had finished. And it goes on. When Jesus had finished these sayings 3 times. When Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, or when Jesus had finished these parables. And that signifies the end of the section. So let's go quick. This is the outline of the book. You have the prologue in chapter 1 and 2. Book 1 opens with the narrative, the story, in chapter 3 through to the end of chapter 4, which of course talks about John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus and the temptations of Jesus in the wilderness. And then you have a discourse or a sermon, chapters 5, 6 and 7, pretty much. And then at the end of chapter 7 is the first formula. When Jesus had finished these sayings. And so you can read it there. When Jesus had finished these sayings, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as the teachers of the law. So that's book 1. Book 2 begins with the story. The narrative accounts, chapter 8 through most of chapter 9. And then we have a discourse or a sermon, pretty much, that's located mostly in chapter 10. And then, when you get to chapter 11, verse 1, when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. And that is book 2. Book 3, of course, also begins with a narrative, and it's not a pretty story, this one. Or at least what happens to John the Baptist in the end isn't. And so there is the narrative, and then from chapter 13 there is the parables that Jesus tells in chapter 13. And chapter 13 verse 53 is the end of the section. See, the chapter divisions don't always fall in the right place. Verse 53, when Jesus had finished these parables, he moved on from there. He went on to another place. And then when you come to book 4, which of course begins in verse 54, we also have another narrative. And that goes for several chapters, through to the end of, well, the middle of chapter 17 rather, and you get a number of stories and things that happen there. And then we find a fairly long discourse. Chapter 18, 17 into chapter 18 rather. And then it ends in chapter 19 verse 1, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan. Then we have the story again in the beginning of book 5, chapter 19 verse 2, through to the end pretty much of chapter 22. And then chapter 23, 24 and 25 are almost one uninterrupted discourse. And at the end of that, in chapter 26 verse 1, when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, and so on, and the Passover was coming. And that's the end of the 5 books. But you'll notice, of course, that there's still a few chapters to go. Chapter 26, 27, 28 and 29. So 4 chapters. And they contain the cross event. Matthew, of course, spends a fair amount of his time on the cross event itself, because book 5 begins in chapter 19, and partway through that is the triumphal entry. Matthew 21 contains that, and that is the last week of the life of Jesus. So the gospel builds toward the cross. It is the high point of the gospel. The gospel begins with Jesus fleeing to Egypt with his parents because Herod wants to destroy him. And it's interesting that that's a theme. People want to destroy him. From Matthew 12:14, verse 14 on, the enemies of Jesus are trying to destroy him, so the cross hangs over him. But the teachings of Jesus are vital to understand the cross. They are the central explanation of the cross. In the early church, there were books that only dealt with the cross, and there were other books that only dealt with the teachings of Jesus. Notice we have none of them, because you have to have both to understand each other. Those books that only contained part were rejected, because the teachings of Jesus cannot be understood without his death, and his death cannot be understood without his teachings. Both of them are essential. So Matthew wants to portray Jesus as the great teacher. That is his intention. That's why there are 5 discourses. And those sermons or teachings emphasize how to live in this world, how to relate to God, and how to treat each other. For Matthew, life is God-centered, not I-centered. And that is where the great contrast between the religion of the Jews and the teachings of Jesus lies. I'm going to repeat that. The greatest contrast lies with the fact that the teachings of the Jews were really about themselves and what they were going to benefit, whereas the teachings of Jesus were other-centered and other-focused. The Jews focused on what they would get. It was about them. And sometimes I have to say, we've even preached the gospel that way. Come to God and you will be blessed. This is what you will get. But that's a false way of putting it, because it's about us at that point. The gospel is in fact about God and what he has done for us. We benefit, to be sure, but it's about him. So Jesus came, of course, not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And that is what true Christianity is about. It puts God first and then others, and self last. Let me try and illustrate this for you. If the teachings of Jesus put God first and self last, what that means is true religion is about God. It is not about us. It is about who God is and what God has done for us. So let's illustrate it. In Matthew 24 and 25, what's the theme? It's a discourse, you already know that. What's the theme? What's it about? Come on. It's about God, yeah, but there's something else in there. It's about the second coming. And typically we think that it's about the signs of the end. So the discussion is the second coming of Jesus. From about verse 4 through 35, Jesus talks about the how and the when and the what of his coming. But from verse 36 of that chapter, Jesus gets very practical. Very practical. He says, no one knows when it's going to happen. And things on earth will be like they've always been, like when Noah was alive. So keep watch, verse 42, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. Keep watch. That's what matters. And how does one watch? Well, he goes on and shares a little parable, a little story. If the house owner had known when the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and not let his house be broken into. So he would have been ready. Be ready, verse 44, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. So being ready means to be ready all the time. Live, Jesus says, expecting him to return. But as you go on and read the rest of the stories that Jesus tells, which take up the major part of this message, it's about how to live while we wait. And if you are living expecting Jesus to return, it will be seen in how you treat others. Because the parable of the servant who is unjust in the end of chapter 24, he says, my Lord has delayed his coming, verse 48. And what does he begin to do? He begins to beat his fellow servants and eat and drink with drunkards. So, because he thinks the Lord has delayed his coming, he's going to be a long time, it shows in how he treats other people. We ought to get a bit uncomfortable about that, because what does how we treat other people say about when we think the Lord's going to return? And this is what these parables deal with, how you treat others, particularly the last two in Matthew 25. So being right with Jesus is seen in how you live and how you treat others. Let's take a quick look at the Sermon on the Mount. And I did say quick because, it fills 3 chapters. Go to Matthew 5. Matthew chapter 5, and of course, Jesus is on the mountainside. Matthew intentionally has Jesus on the mountainside. Where was the law proclaimed in Exodus? From a mountain. Here, Jesus is on a mountain. And he deepens and he expands the law. And the first thing there is the Beatitudes. Now, did you know the gospel is in the Beatitudes? Blessed are the poor in spirit. The poor in spirit are those who see their true condition. And as a result, blessed are they who mourn, because they know what their condition is. They know their condition. And because they mourn, they are poor in spirit, they know their condition, they are also humble and meek because of it. There's no reason to build yourself up against anyone else because you know what you are. And that creates a hunger and a thirst for something better. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. And as a result of that, blessed are the merciful. They are merciful toward others because they know that others struggle with the same kinds of things that they have struggled with and perhaps still do. So they are merciful. And that means, because God is working in their lives, that He's giving them a pure heart. And when you have a pure heart, you are a peacemaker. But that doesn't mean everyone will like you. Blessed are those who are persecuted, because that's what happens when God really works. There are those that can't stand purity. Look what happened to Jesus. But you are blessed if that happens. Blessed you are when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward. Where? In heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So you're in good company. They did that to the prophets too. But if you have the gospel, if you have Jesus in your life, then you are the salt of the earth. Live for God. Righteousness that matters is not righteousness that you can count. That kind of righteousness, that of the Pharisees, is worthless. God requires a righteousness greater than that of the Pharisees. That would have been a shock to Jesus' hearers, by the way. Greater than theirs? Yes, because human beings can't work it up. You can't generate righteousness. It's something God gives. And now let's really put the foot down to go through this Sermon on the Mount. Murder isn't just killing, it can be done with words. Adultery isn't just the physical act, it happens in the thoughts. Marriage is meant to last. God hates divorce. Be people of your word. If you give your word, keep it. Help others. And then at the end of that chapter, love others, especially your enemies. Especially those who are painful, difficult people. You have some of those in your life? I do. One lives over the back fence. Love your enemies. When they're being difficult and painful, I want to love them, all right? And you too, right? But that's not what Jesus said to do. Love your enemies. Pray for them. Because in doing so, you will be reflecting the love of God, and that's what being perfect means. You will be perfect like He is when you love others, especially your enemies. Give to others. Chapter 6. Pray. Fast. Don't put your trust in worldly possessions. Store them up in heaven. Put God first in your lives. And don't worry about clothing or food or those earthly things. That must have been a shock to the hearers too. Especially in that context, if you remember what we shared about that context some months ago now. Don't worry about clothing or food, but Lord, I don't even know what I'm going to eat tomorrow. Don't worry about those things, Jesus said. Seek God, put Him first, and all the things you need, notice He never said want, will be given to you as well. And don't judge others, chapter 7. That's God's job. Seek God. Ask, seek, knock. Seek God. He wants to bless you. You don't have to twist His arm for Him to bless you. He wants to bless you, but seek Him. And seek Him for those blessings. Don't go with the crowd. That leads the wrong way. And it isn't the way to heaven. It's the broad way that leads downward to destruction. Be careful about pretenders. You'll know them by their characteristics, their fruit. And what their fruit are will determine whether they're in the kingdom. And that goes for us too. But if you really know God, it will show in how you live. And then, the end of the chapter, chapter 7, Jesus says that these sayings of mine, put them into practice. The one who puts them into practice is like the one who builds his house upon the rock, and the rains descended and the floods came and the wind blew. You know the story. The wise man built his house upon the rock. But the one who hears these sayings of mine and doesn't put them into practice is a fool who builds on sand. So hear, but hearing isn't sufficient. Put it into practice. So that was a brief look at Matthew. Matthew wants us to know that Jesus fulfills Old Testament prophecy. Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. Matthew's gospel was a gospel written for the Jews because he quotes the Old Testament 41 times. So it's the most Jewish, and strangely it's the most anti-Jewish too, because they crucified him. Jesus is the new Moses. He gives the law in the Sermon on the Mount, and having given the law, he heads for another mountain to live that law, to put it into practice. He was merciful, pure in heart, and persecuted. Yet, he turned the other cheek. He proclaimed the law, then he lived it. Jesus practiced what he preached. He did it, ultimately, on Mount Calvary. I'm so glad he did, aren't you?